And Becky, I want to thank you for the work to help to organize this and bring everybody together. And I, I do believe everything you just said. And I didn't even coming into the room, I was sort of trying to understand what the NUICC does and is working on, and I'm sort of still getting an understanding of it. But the more I get an understanding of it, the more I believe that this is absolutely the discussion we need to be having as a nation, and as provincial and municipal governments, and working together with First Nations governments, Métis governments, and also the urban Indigenous population. So as we often do, we recognize that we're on Treaty 6 territory and the traditional homeland of the Métis. And, now we're at a place where we're trying to figure out what does it mean to build a treaty relationship in 2023, based on how badly that treaty relationship was followed when it was signed from 1876 to these recent years. And what does it mean for a municipality that is on Treaty 6 territory, is right adjacent to the Round Prairie Métis settlement, that has had people who are First Nations and Métis be marginalized in our community for generations, and now we have to find a way to build governance that is honors that understanding. And I've been learning more and more about what the spirit and intent of Treaty 6 was, and I believe inherent there are some very powerful concepts like mio cheto, and the concept of that any community that is able to support its citizens to care, protect, and to make sure the citizens can live a good life, mio pimatiso, and you have to have a strong circle of relationships between those who are responsible, the leadership, the institutions, the organizations, to be able to support people to live a good life. And right now we have a fragmented and broken system that it does not put relationships at the heart of it. And so and reorganizing, one of the other things I've learned in my role is that one of the hardest things to change, or one of the strongest forces in the universe, is the status quo, somebody said to me. And that our governments, our bureaucracies don't change easily, and we don't know how to even listen differently, or structure meetings differently, or set up meetings so that we're truly listening to one another in the spirit of what I believe that treaty relationship is. So then now today we know that which province you're in or across the country, 60 to 80% of the Indigenous population lives in cities. And we have a historical structure of governance that has the federal jurisdiction over First Nations, with people on reserve, and a very unclear kind of set of obligations and responsibilities for what happens to the off reserve population that's in cities. But I spent my morning in a committee talking about the fact that we have a whole bunch of homeless people in our city right now that don't even have access to public washrooms or drinking water. We're hitting record temperatures right now. We have just talking to my friend from Winnipeg, who your first name went right out, the co-chair, Damon. Sorry, Damon. Damon was talking about the circumstances in Winnipeg that they're facing, and we have this urgent need to build the programs and the systems and the partnerships so people can have their basic needs met, and we have a very complex set of relationships to work out. So if today you're helping to move forward is an understanding of how we build. I like that it says governance. Stories have always been our governance, and this sort of understanding of what do we build? How do we build a governance model that understands how do we work together? That it includes municipalities, rights holding First Nations, rights holding Métis nations, and includes the voice and the reality and the experience of urban Indigenous people and provincial and federal governments. I believe that we are in a moment in our country where we have more municipalities interested in how to have that conversation than ever. And I get to sit with the Big City Mayors Caucus twice a year, the mayors of the largest cities in the country. And there's been more talk of how do we blow up or change our systems to be able to better meet especially the needs of the urban Indigenous population than I've ever heard. We have a group of prairie mayors that are wanting to work together to work towards this, but we don't know the answers, and we have to figure out how to build enough of a way of having a trusted dialogue between the rights holding governments, the urban Indigenous population, and our local municipalities, and the federal government, is an absolutely critical part of this, and the provincial government each have its role to get there. So as I said, there's urgency because right now people are living in conditions they should not be living in, and there's complexity, and I feel that tension every day, and I also am heartened to see that these are the conversations that are happening. This is the only way to get there, is to sit down with each other and learn from people like Sakej and Gilbert and the people who can provide us guidance on how to get there. And I'm sure many of you who are in the room who I don't know. So I'm looking forward to, I'm able to be here till 1, and then I have to drive to Melville to listening to what the conversation is. But hopefully that perspective from what I see in my role as mayor and also co-chair of the Big City Mayors Caucus, because this is a national conversation, gives you a sense of, from a municipal perspective, where we see this.
Dr. James Sagaj Henderson is with us via Zoom. So we are going to host a discussion about, and some of the things that we have introduced is building an infrastructure that supports the sustainable implementation of UNDRIP. And how do we have those conversations so that we can get it right? And we have recognized across the country that the infrastructure of diversity and inclusion, or the infrastructure of equity, diversity, and inclusion, along with sometimes the concepts of justice that are outcomes based, are the infrastructures that we are seeing. And what we recognize is that these are the same infrastructures that have not been successful in addressing concepts such as urban Indigenous rights and well-being. So hosting this discussion today, we will have Sagaj to be able to share some of the implications, specifically around implication for municipalities. And then we'll also, after that, host a panel discussion with some local Indigenous practitioners, anti-racism practitioners, and also with Lindsay Krushmer, Verna St. Dennis, Manuela Valle Castro will be on the panel to be able to respond not only to the comments of Sagaj, but also comments from the room and also on the Zoom. So it is a great pleasure of mine to be able to introduce Dr. Sagaj Henderson. Sagaj is a visiting instructor in Cape Breton University and a retired director of the Native Law Centre of Canada. He is a member of the Chickasaw Nation, and he's married to Marie Batiste, a Mi'kmaq educator and scholar, and they have 3 children. He received a Juris Doctorate in law from Harvard University in 1974 and served as a constitutional advisor for the Mi'kmaq Nation and the Assembly of First Nations during constitutional negotiations from 1978 to 1993. He is a legal advisor of the Sante Mawio Mi of the Mi'kmaq Nation. He is one of the strategists that created Indigenous diplomacy in the UN system and part of the drafting team of many of the existing declarations. He was one of the strategist, expert advisors, and drafters of the United Nations Principles and Guidelines for the Protection of Indigenous Heritage and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. For his achievements, he received the Indigenous Peoples Council Award in 2005, the National Aboriginal Achievement Award for Law and Justice in 2006, and an honorary doctorate from the Carleton University in 2007. He became a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada in 2013. He was elected a Fellow of the Native American Academy in 1985, awarded the Indigenous Peoples Council the National Aboriginal Achievement Award for Law and Justice, and an honorary doctorate of laws from Carleton University in 2007 and from McGill University in 2022, and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada in 2013. So please welcome Dr. Sagesh Henderson. Thank you. So I'm wondering if you are able to share your thoughts on the UNDRIP implementation, specifically as it pertains to municipalities, and your thoughts and reflections on that.
Sure. I think it's a really interesting situation, both internationally and domestically, that we're encouraged to rethink the whole issue of federalism and cooperative federalism, and what's happening in the bigger UN system is that the UN system, although it's supposed to be really just about the states, have been slowly and gradually moving further and further away from the states into human rights. And since about 1917, they've really started focusing on the real issue of cities and how human rights and cities are supposed to intermesh. And they've created a whole lot of dialogues and structure, sometimes just around the problem of immigration and settlement. Most of the cities in Canada have really adopted and supported UNDRIP, and it's almost all of them. I'm not sure about Edmonton, but Vancouver, Calgary, Saskatoon, Regina, Winnipeg, Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal have all adopted UNDRIP as the support and guiding to carry on. Those who haven't usually have adopted the TRC calls to action, which also bring in UNDRIP. So with the federal court's decision on urban Indians, saying that they're analogous to band reserves, the Musqueam decision in 2002 have set up a whole new parameter for providing infrastructures in the cities for Indigenous peoples. The government hasn't fleshed this out too much, as they still seem to be locked into the idea that the Indian Act defines Indigenous peoples, and of course the Indian Act doesn't. That all the real Indigenous people are either Aboriginal peoples and have Aboriginal rights, or they have treaty rights. That's far surpass anything in the Indian Act, and we haven't come to grips with that as a nation, or even as the federal government, or the provinces and the municipalities are just now starting to understand this difference. The major problem that everyone's encountering is that all these inherent rights, which are called Aboriginal rights in Canada, and the treaty rights are all portable, and they all are contained within the human bodies that move around. That they're called inherent because no government gave them to it. No government can take it away from them, that they have these rights that they're carrying. And all these rights are constitutional rights, as well as now the UNDRIP rights of more inherent rights, which really just spell out the definition of what an Aboriginal rights is, that created so much problems in the courts and in the politicians. So we have a whole conglomeration of inherent rights that Indigenous people have, no matter where they are or where they're at, confronting a structure, a colonial structure of federal government, provinces, and municipalities, which don't really have any standing in the Constitution. However, they also have to respect the treaty rights and also the inherent rights of every Indigenous person. Because Aboriginal and treaty rights are constitutional rights that apply to every governmental agency, whether they're federal, provincial, or municipality. And people are just starting to come to that understanding. The human rights in the UN system is really transforming their attitudes toward urbanization and their attitudes toward cities. That they've created a new category called human rights cities. And those are cities who are responsible for implementing human rights. And they're responsible for developing and promoting human rights. And this is a new kind of concept that's coming about. They've forged a World Human Rights City Forum that happens every year. And they've also created a United Cities and Local Government Agencies since about 2019. And they're moving into the new urban agenda at the UN system. And they're also moving into what's called the Sustainable Development Goals. And the Sustainable Development Goals are all explicitly human rights goals, but they're phased as a different kind of goals. But Goal 11 applies to cities, and it applies to cities to be places that are inclusive, sustainable, safe, and other things for Indigenous people and other peoples. And these are all very new trends in the UN system, that they're trying to shed all the obstacles in the past that said that affected human rights, and said human rights were just sort of something that was a national government's problem or a provincial government's problems. That they're shedding all of this and saying that human rights are the key to what's happening around the world called urbanization, and it has to be sustainable and socially inclusive. It's got to promote equality. You got to combat discrimination in all of its forms, but you have to empower individuals, but you also have to empower collective rights of people that have human rights. So this is creating and opening up an untapped potential for the promotion and protection of human rights for all city inhabitants, but more importantly, for Indigenous people in Canada and around the world to become involved in the management of their lives in the city in a collective way, and also in a way that puts them into decision making and also puts them into the labor force and also social and economic development. So it's a big, broad movement, and Canada's just barely on the cusp of understanding what it means, because they're still stuck in a colonial paradigm that they're trying to move off of. Do you have any questions on that?
I was just about to ask you a question, actually, Sagesh. So when we're discussing the inherent rights of Indigenous people, I'm wondering if you can expand on that a little bit to understand inherent rights of Indigenous people, and what that crossroads or that intersection is, and the problematic nature of inherent Indigenous rights for urban Indigenous people.
Yeah, that's a great question. That the inherent rights is such a key concept of the UNDRIP declaration. And it's really saying that what you would call in the old Cree word of the soul spirit or the soul fire, or what people call the spark that's within each human. That's an inherent right. And that inherent right to be who you are and to manifest that humanity is now built into the UNDRIP situation of law, and it's also built into the provincial law in BC, and it's built into the federal law. They're trying to figure out how to implement that. The difference between that and almost the rest of Eurocentric movement has been a Eurocentric movement from oppression to equality, but they have sort of stopped at equality of an individual, and they haven't moved to any kind of collective rights because they assume that the government or the king or the monarchs held the collective governments, and everyone who had an individual right in the Eurocentric tradition had to get that right given to it by the king or the government. Inherent rights, no one gives it to you except your birth. You have it from birth on. You have to learn how to manifest it. But the human rights international law is all based around that you have this inherent right and no one can take it away from you. The question is how you manifest it. Now, the problem everyone's confronting is that since 1946, when we started moving into human rights, is all the governments have been very skeptical of it because they don't control it, that they didn't delegate it. And even though we have 46 articles in UNDRIP explaining it as the minimum, none of those words really mean anything because the humans have it within them as inherent rights, even if they didn't have the writing. Even if we didn't draft the declaration, they would have those rights, and those rights would have to be respected. We drafted those rights from the indigenous communities' legal traditions around the world through compromise to get the minimum that we could agree to with the nation states. We had a lot more that we wanted to talk about. One of the things they really resisted is when we wanted to talk about love, they wanted to talk about wellness because they have a very difficult time with this concept of inherent love that is the basis of most Indigenous law. So they would translate that as well-being, and you'll find that throughout the declaration, is that when they're talking about well-being, we're talking about empathy and human love for each other and kindness and things like that, that they had a little problem with in the drafting process because they're not used to this Indigenous paradigm that every Indigenous person around the world is now carrying and manifesting and changing the delegated structure of the rights.
So we're really seeing in action a collision of the worldview, of an Indigenous worldview in a colonial structure that is inadequate at being able to uphold that inherent Indigenous right.
Yeah, it's transforming, but even when we're talking with the federal bureaucracy, they really can't get over that. They think the highest standard we can get is to be equal to a non-Aboriginal person. And we keep saying, that's fine to be equal, but we still have all of these rights our ancestors ensured us with, and we have a worldview and now inherent rights that we're carrying that we can't compromise on because we didn't create them. And we have no way to compromise. And the bureaucracy keeps saying, well, everyone should be equal. And we go, that's a great theory, but you have hierarchies everywhere. Hierarchies in the bureaucracy, hierarchies between Canada and provinces and the municipalities, and none of these hierarchies are constitutionally valid against the Aboriginal and treaty rights.
We could take a couple of minutes actually as we're doing this and rebalance, get a drink, get some coffee, get comfortable, go to the bathroom, and then we'll introduce the panel members into this conversation with Saigesh. We'll also have the opportunity to open it to questions to the floor and then also in Zoom. Thanks for your patience while we just reconfigured a little bit. I would like to introduce my fellow panel members. I'd like to start to join the conversation. I do have a couple of more questions, I guess, actually, that I'd like to pose to you. But I'd like to introduce my colleagues and a mentor, Verna St. Denis. Verna St. Denis is an incredibly renowned and internationally known anti-racist practitioner who has made an incredible impact on a number of grad students who are continuing to practice anti-racism education in schools and also in industry. So I'm very happy to be able to have you here, Verna, to be able to contribute to the conversation.
Thanks, Becky. Thank you.
Also with me is Dr. Manuela Valle Castro. I feel like I need to say that it seems so strange to read people's bios when you're sitting. I know, so when they're sitting right here, so I'm wanting to be able to introduce people and give them the recognition that they are due without making them feel like they're on the spot by reading a bio while they're here. So I believe that the accomplishments warrant recognition. And I'm wanting to be able to acknowledge that. So another colleague of mine is Dr. Manuela Valle Castro, and I heard her speak one time at a conference. And as soon as I heard her speak, I was like, I need to know who that is. And so I immediately went over to introduce myself, and we became very closely linked in our like-mindedness and in our practice. And I will actually ask panel members perhaps to share a little bit about themselves as we're just waiting for Lindsay, one more panel member. And while we're doing that, I do have a question actually that I would like Saigesh to perhaps share some of your thoughts on the concept that at the national level we're also grappling with and trying to understand is the concept of urban Indigenous representation. So as Saigesh has explained, that we as Indigenous people have inherent rights as Indigenous people. So if we leave the reserve, or if we leave our home communities and go into the cities, we don't stop being Indigenous people. We continue to be Indigenous people, even in population centers or in municipalities. So as Indigenous people with rights, who represents urban Indigenous people? So recently there is a decision from the Misquatis decision. I need my glasses. So Misquatis is a federal court decision that recognizes urban Indigenous communities as legal entities, and UNDRIP includes rights to self-determination. So how does combining UNDRIP and the Misquatis affirm urban Indigenous rights is the first question. And then which leads to the question of how does UNDRIP provide a framework for social policy action in municipalities? And with that, I would like to hear from Saigesh, and then we'll continue the conversation with the rest of the panel members, including the conversations of the current infrastructure of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion.
Yeah, those are great questions, and the answers are not very clear in one sense. They're very clear in another sense. They're very clear that no longer can municipalities and federal funding agencies discriminate against urban Indian people. Um, that's the clearest decision. That's just a charter violation under Section 15 Equality Clause. And it's also, the court found that there was no justification under Article 1 of the Charter for discriminating against urban people versus reserve people. And that's been a trend that's been going on for a long time in federal government. The key thing is that most people, most Indigenous people are carrying treaty rights, or they're carrying Aboriginal rights that are constitutionally protected. They're not really carrying anymore what Indian Affairs considers rights. And they have a very narrow definition of what a right is. And we've challenged that over and over, and mostly have won on those challenges, but they still maintain that the decision of the federal court was very clear in saying that people in the urban areas can organize, can be considered carrying the same rights as Indians on the reserve. The court says they're analogous to a reserve when they organized. And if they organize, they have a right to effective representation in municipalities in decisions that will affect them. And those are really clear from the federal court, and it was approved by the Court of Appeals. What happens now is that in UNDRIP, the key provision in UNDRIP says that none of these inherent rights in UNDRIP can be seen as limiting an Aboriginal right that you have or a treaty right. So these are all additive to the treaty rights and to Aboriginal rights that you may have. And that opens up a much wider thing. One of the key things that UNDRIP says is that every international human rights law that exists in the United Nations or will exist applies to Indigenous peoples. And that's very broad. It's way beyond what most people think when they think of UNDRIP. UNDRIP brings in all of those and applies it to be equally. But more importantly, there's a section 17 that says that all international labor codes and national labor codes apply to Indigenous peoples. And the key thing about UNDRIP and our constitutional rights of Aboriginal people is they do not have the on-reserve, off-reserve distinction that we've had to live with the Indian Act. And so all of these are challenging the Indian Act provisions about on-reserve and off-reserve, that these are all rights that people carry with them, and they have a right to move toward employment, and they have a right to be treated equal. And that's just the beginning. And beyond that, there's a whole collective right of a tribe, nation that's in play in the cities as well.
How would you think that that frames a social policy action for municipalities? And I'd also like to recognize that an implementation of the UNDRIP framework looks at redefining relationships with Indigenous people, but also the internal infrastructure as well. So in terms of UNDRIP, how would you think that that framework provides a social policy action for municipalities?
Well, it basically says that any federal policy that's effective, that comes out of the federal government, has to apply equally to on-reserve and off-reserve. There can no longer distinguish between that in all the grants that are available to them. This is going to be strengthened a little bit more when federal laws are starting to be made consistent with UNDRIP. This will become clearer. But the key thing to understand is that any for municipal law or even local government law or provincial law or federal law that's inconsistent with an Aboriginal or treaty right will be void to the extent of the inconsistency. So it gives us the power beyond the charter to strike down all kind of policies that are discriminatory against the Aboriginal people in the urban situation.
So one of that I think that we can recognize is the fact, as you have mentioned, Saigaj, that Indigenous people are not being included in decisions or in governance structures that affect the outcomes and the well-being of Indigenous people on their own lands and territories. So there is a, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, it's absolutely, it's everyone is still caught in the colonial idea of off reserve and on reserve, which really should be a vanishing concept because it's discriminatory in all of its functions. What we have to do now is to really start approaching policy and laws in the municipalities to say that where should we have effective communications and where should we have decision making, and that's on economic and social matters, health, housing, economics, things like that. All of those programs have to be relooked at to see whether they're discriminatory. It doesn't really much matter to a constitutional right whether it's a federal policy or a federal initiative or a provincial initiative. They all have to be consistent with Aboriginal and treaty rights. And UNDRIP just explains more what an Aboriginal right is.
So I would like to introduce the idea of current infrastructures that we're recognizing that are popping up across the country, and the philosophy around the creation of those particular infrastructures and how that may and does collide with this idea of respecting and honoring Indigenous rights. And because we are a coalition of coalitions, the National Urban Indigenous Coalitions Council, we are a coalition of urban Indigenous people in communities that are greatly affected by municipal policy, in not only municipal policy, but provincial policy and federal policy as well. So the infrastructure that we're seeing as being very common is the justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. So as we understand settler colonialism, or the hierarchy of colonial society, is imposed upon the way in which Indigenous people must manage themselves, and what the federal and provincial and municipal governments allow us to be able to do, which essentially infringes upon our inherent and treaty rights. So if I can invite my panel members to be able to participate in this discussion with me. I'm wondering if, first of all, Verna, if you might share with us your thoughts of the origins of what we're currently seeing as the building blocks of those infrastructures across the country. Or you can reframe that question however you feel comfortable.
Oh. Well, okay.
Sorry, you really
yeah,
can't reframe that question how you feel comfortable responding.
Well, I'll just start with a little bit of an introduction.
Please, yes.
So I've been coming to this city for over 5 decades. And my extended family are, I think, some of the first who moved into this city. My mom's sister's family lived above where the Mandarin on Avenue C and 20th is. And my dad's family, his extended family, lived on 39th Street and about Avenue B, Avenue C in that area. And I mean, if I go back even further, my mom used to tell me stories about her father being on the crew building the Bez and her family living somewhere camping on the east side. And my mom going to the top of the Broadway Bridge waiting for her dad at the end of the day. And that story, I don't know how to confirm, but she has told me stories that seemed fantastical to me that I have been able to confirm through archival research. So when I first came to the city in the late 70s, mid 70s, I participated in committees at City Hall that were chaired by Helen Hughes. And so that was where, you know, I kind of made connection with people throughout the city. And the committee, of course, that I was most interested in was how to respond to kids who were Indigenous kids who were not attending public education. And so, you know, even back then, I observed that the city and the various institutions that comprise the city and our society, you know, sometimes responded positively, but mostly struggled with meeting the needs of Indigenous people. And so all these years, I am an anti-racist educator. And so my argument has been the struggle is rooted in that structural and institutionalized racism. And it has been a powerful tool of colonialism, settler colonialism, which of course I can speak to in more depth, depending on the time. So returning to institutions that comprise these cities and our society, one that I focused on is scholarship in public education, specifically the ability of public education to meet the needs of Indigenous children. And struggling, meaning who has struggled? Human resources have been a struggle, policy and curriculum have historically been hostile to Indigenous people, our histories and our inherent rights. And so one of these policies has been multiculturalism, which I think is in part like the precursor to what we now understand as justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So, you know, it's like multiculturalism, but reinvented under a new name. And so so that's, you know, I researched the history of, and that's what Becky asked me to speak to, the history of multiculturalism. And I didn't start researching it until I started to hear Indigenous teachers in public education talking about the way in which their presence in public education, their ability to contribute Indigenous content was being resisted under a discourse of like, there are other children here. We're honoring, you know, this is a multicultural institution. So it became a way to silence the work of Indigenous teachers. And so when I thought to think about making writing a paper on those experiences, what is the context for the Indigenous teachers' experiences in public education, not only in the city, but throughout the province and the country, I recall that back in the late 70s and the early 80s, that Indigenous leaders, political leaders, were resisting a policy of multiculturalism, but I didn't quite understand what that was about. And so this was the opportunity for me to explore that history. And so what I learned is that multiculturalism arose through the 60s, the late 60s in particular, in response to competing and contested claims around language. So the introduction of the bilingualism of Canada, cultural and language and land claims within the nation. So in 1971, Prime Minister Trudeau introduced the policy of multiculturalism. And then in 88, Mulroney made the Multicultural Act the national law. But what I discovered in my research is that multiculturalism was introduced so that bilingualism would not create more problems. So there was that resistance to the idea that Canada was constituted of two founding nations, the British and the French. And so the idea of the Multicultural Act of 1988 addressed the concerns of multiple ethnic groups, such as Ukrainians, who wanted the recognition of their presence and contributions to Canada. And so this idea, okay, we will give you the opportunity to display your dinner, dance, and dress. And that's the extent of your participation in our society. And so you begin to see how a policy of multiculturalism would go up against Indigenous inherent rights. And so, of course, I also explored that, and I don't think I'll stop there, but that's part of the history. And so part of what I did was to also in that paper is to take a look at what are the similar and distinct experiences or critiques that settlers of color or racialized immigrants have with a policy of EDI multiculturalism, and how is it distinct from Indigenous critique of EDI? And I have a whole list, but I'll stop there. We can cover that.
Yes, continuing conversation. We'll be able to address and expand. So my next, I just see His Worship the Mayor leaving, so I'm wanting to say thank you so much for being with us and take care. My next question is for Dr. Valle Castro Manuela. What is the problematic nature of such frameworks with regard to Indigenous people in Canada? We ask the immigrant.
Thank you, Becky. I'm first so honored to be in this panel with such good company and people with the trajectory that we have heard. And especially, I'm very honored to be invited here as a non-Indigenous person to Canada, as a person who's non-Indigenous to Canada, and who actually, in my own context, who represents the colonial majority, the dominant group. I still have, when Becky first asked me to participate in this reflection about UNDRIP and justice and equity, diversity and inclusion, I was wondering if I had something to contribute to the discussion, but I realized that I do have a perspective on how we have globally tried to use different tactics for decolonization, and how some of these tactics are legal and involve the state as an instrument for change and transformation. So I did have some thoughts. So maybe I'll also take the freedom to reformulate. I also want to introduce myself as a member of the Anti-Racism Network, and my day job is as the director of the Division of Social Accountability at the College of Medicine at the University of Saskatchewan. So I was trying to think about the context from the context of where I come from, Chile in South America, and how this idea of UNDRIP as an instrument that can be used to confront colonial violence and things like extractivism and self-determination. And I was remembering two things. One, that before UNDRIP, there was one other norm in the International Labor Organization that was used in South America to assert Indigenous rights. And that, it was interesting how at the beginning of the 1990s, with the commemoration of the 500 years of colonization, there was an important resurgence of Indigenous struggles in South America, and in particular in Ecuador and in Bolivia, right? And later, if you will remember, in 1994, the Zapatista right? The Zapatista insurgency, which was an indigenous insurgency, that it's still going on, right? It's still a process that we need to look at. So I was contemplating how countries like Bolivia and Ecuador, they used the state as a way to carry out processes of decolonization. And if you remember in the, and I don't know how well informed you are about the first government of Evo Morales in Bolivia, which you have to consider that having an indigenous president in South America was the most revolutionary thing that we could have, because we have been countries with mestizo dominance. People that look like me have Spanish, Italian last names, right? Fair-skinned, that speak Spanish, right? So the government of Evo Morales had, for example, a Ministry of Decolonization and Depatriarchalization, right? Which is a very interesting thing to contemplate, that we can use, right, the structures of the colonial state to completely change, to put an agenda of transformation. Of course, you may know that Evo Morales faced immense backlash from the dominant majorities, and ultimately, were they offended about having to learn about indigenous languages or culture? No. What did Evo touch? The productive and economic processes, right? Which is similar to, and something very important that I wanted to mention is that in the case of Ecuador and Bolivia, the concept was to formulate the plurinational state, right? Which is, so then it's a form of governance that recognizes that within the structure of the state, there's nation-to-nation relationships, right? And it's a conversation that I haven't really heard in this side of the hemisphere. I also remember that in 2007, when UNDRIP was first came to the scene, Canada was one of the 4 countries that you'll remember did not sign it, voted against it with the US, Australia, and New Zealand, right? So all the Commonwealth, British, right, Commonwealth colonies, post-colonies, right, understood very well that recognizing indigenous sovereignty and self-determination, it's pretty much the end of all these countries, because these countries have been set up as a front for British and now transnational extractivism, right? Let's talk real, right? What is Canada other than a corporate front for transnational extractivism, right? And I mean, when that happened, the entire world understood Canada finally, like, oh, yeah, so this is where you are, right? You're a capitalist country that requires to the control of the means and the processes of economic production, right? So when we're talking about political governance, it's very important to remember that the political governance is a function of the economic and productive processes, right? So the state won't blink if we want to, diversify languages, diversify culture, right? It's the moment that you touch the land. And I was going to say, maybe that is the limit in which we can use these instruments of the state, right? Because when you touch the land, Oka happens. Sweden happens, right? Then we see the real face of the state, right? The violence of the state when you touch the economic and the productive processes, I think it's the limit of all these instruments that we're using and deploying as different tactics that can be useful for decolonizing. I personally, for example, as somebody who already went through a TRC in my own country, I didn't have much faith, to be completely frank, in the TRC calls to action that were issued in 2015. Because your TRC is very similar to us. It focuses on the victims, but it offers no accountability for the perpetrators, right? And it's a state-imposed narrative of now we have to look forward, forgiveness, forget about the truth, forget about actually transforming any of the structures that continue to perpetuate oppression to Indigenous peoples, right? So it was very, very reminiscent, that reconciliation, but I'm finding actually that these instruments are not inherently failed, but depend on how we strategically use them, right? So for example, I think that the way that we've been using the TRC calls in the last almost 10 years to, for example, call for the recognition of UNDRIP, right? Constantly bringing these calls as that bring us back to UNDRIP are a good tactic that we're deploying. And the last thing that I want to say, sorry for talking so long, but is that the local, because we understand that the state is not also like a monolith, right? But that the local level of governance, actually, it can be a very flexible level, right? In which we can experiment and stretch the limits of what can be done, and things can be reinvented in ways that are not necessarily possible at the other levels of governance that we have here. So yeah, I find this conversation very exciting. Thank you.
Thank you. So municipalities are very flexible, right? And they're the most closest to, you know, the people, well, that they are creating laws for. So my next question, and I invite you, Lindsay, to share a little bit about yourself. But my next question is, with this information that we understand, and I'm not going to pose the question, I'm just going to ask you actually to share your thoughts in the position that you are in with and the relationship with municipalities.
Yeah, we'll go. Thanks, Becky. Sego, good afternoon. My name is Lindsay. My government name. My spirit name is Swooping Hawk, and I'm the executive director of the Toronto Aboriginal Support Services Council, which is a coalition based in Toronto that's been around for almost 2 decades, incorporated for just over 10. We work with 22 Indigenous-led organizations in the city of Toronto, and Toronto is a very, very diverse city here in the context of Turtle Island. Toronto is home to an estimated 80,000 Indigenous folks, and there's an estimated 26 Indigenous-led, Indigenous-serving nonprofits that are working with our people. And so when you look at those numbers, it's quite disproportionate, likely the case for other cities. When I think about the notions of equity, diversity, and inclusion, and this is something that we're seeing and we're witnessing an explosion across the country within spaces and places, philanthropic, government, corporate, it exists everywhere. And I think there's this idea and widely held belief that we automatically are loaded into that term of equity, diversity, and inclusion, or EDI as they often call it back home. In 2017, I worked for the municipal government for about 5 minutes. It turns out I'm not a good bureaucrat. I was hired to work within at the time it was called the Equity, Diversity, and Human Rights Office of the City Manager at City of Toronto. And in that capacity, I was hired to be the lone Indigenous affairs consultant to serve 30,000 non-Indigenous employees to help them navigate what it meant to work with Indigenous communities, what it meant to understand a post-TRC environment. And in that same experience, I can recall asking where to go to smudge. Where do employees or the public, where do they go to smudge, for instance, or practice culture or ceremony within the construct of City Hall? I was directed to go outside. And if you've ever been to Toronto and Nathan Phillips Square, it's a busy place and it's real cold in March. So it's not where we go to smudge. And so, well, maybe we do. But it was interesting because, you know, they didn't understand what to do with that request in 2017, post 2015. Regrettably, it actually resulted in a human rights case for the city of Toronto. And then we witnessed transformation from a lone Indigenous consulting position to an actual Indigenous affairs office, now made up of multiple employees that are still, after 5 years, and they're fairly new, learning to navigate the bureaucracy that is the city of Toronto. The municipality of Toronto is still learning. I think that there's a long way for many municipalities to go in terms of understanding the roles and responsibilities that they have to urban Indigenous residents. When I think about, you know, the context of EDI, to me, it's implied assimilation, and I return back to teachings that I was given And that's the teachings of the Gaswenta, also known as the Turo Wampum. Many of you may be familiar with this. Yeah. Oh, I speak too fast. I always speak too fast. Okay. No problem. Yeah, no problem. So the Turo Wampum, the Gaswenta, is an agreement that was made between the Dutch and the Haudenosaunee. And it is one of the oldest treaties in Canada. And it speaks to the concept of traveling down the rivers of life. There are two rivers of life. We are traveling down our respective path. Becky, can I get you to hold that for me? Yeah, I'll go. Thank you. We're traveling down our respective paths with our ways of knowing, being, seeing, and doing. And our friends, the settlers, they're traveling down their river of life with their ways of knowing, being, seeing, and doing. And we agreed that we would travel and peacefully coexist as equals, never interfering in one another's customs or ways of life. We were to be grounded in peace, friendship, and respect according to the three white rows. Now we know that the government didn't uphold their end of the bargain. And my book actually it's funny. It's called Things to Remember That I'll Probably Forget. So the government obviously forgot its promise. But when I think about EDI discourse, I think about the significance and the importance of the Gaswenta and returning to that. When we use the word self-determination, article number 3 of UNDRIP, I think what we're asking for is the opportunity to be able to author solutions to our own opportunities and challenges within urban spaces, especially. Municipal governments will often say that they are absolved of any kind of responsibility. They want to bunt that back to the province, who then wants to bunt it back to the feds. And there's this constant jurisdictional wrangling that occurs among them. But I think by and large, we're starting to see and make progress. If I look back to a decade ago, we weren't making progress in the conversation about what self-determination looks like and what did it mean to be urban Indigenous and what are the notions of diversity within indigeneity. We are not all the same. We are not one pan group of people. We have our own nations, customs, cultures, languages, geo-origins, things that make us within our own right very diverse. And so I think if anybody needs to learn about diversity, it's our non-Indigenous friends who come up with these EDI concepts such that they can appreciate the diversity that exists among us as a people. Yeah, we'll go.
Thanks, Lindsay. I would like to introduce an additional complexity to the conversation, and I'm going to ask my co-chair, Damon Johnson from Winnipeg, to share thoughts on the complexity of distinctions based as it pertains to urban Indigenous people.
Where do I start? And I'll use Winnipeg as an example because that's where I lived and worked for the last, since 1983 this time. I lived there before that in the 60s. So for us who live in cities, it's been a fascinating journey. And in Winnipeg, one that's over 70 years, arguably even before then, because we use the 70 years from approximately 1958 when the Indian and Métis Friendship Center of Winnipeg was established. And that organization came to be because we had no place to go, even to socialize with our fellow urban citizens. And that's again another unique aspect of friendship centers, that they were sort of built on a medicine wheel basis, and they were open to anyone. So not just Indigenous, non-Indigenous persons were welcome too. And so that was a huge difference with our people who were living on reserves, with Métis settlements, with Inuit settlements, is that we were open in cities to everyone, and that's the way it is today. The other unique thing was that again, in terms of differences, these organizations, so starting with the Friendship Center, now 7 years later, at least 32 organizations that are part of the coalition that I work with, the Winnipeg Indigenous Executive Circle. So 32 of them were basically established by a mix of First Nations and Métis persons working together, coming together, recognizing a huge shortage of programs and services that were structured by ourselves, so they had cultural competency built right in from day one. And it gave members of our community access to services in their own language, or whatever that was. So it was in Manitoba, we have 5, we have Michif, Oji Cree, Cree Innu, Anishinaabe, and Dakota and Lakota. So, and Dene. So that's an important aspect too, because, you know, still a number of members of our community, English is not their first language. And so it's hard to work with someone when you can't communicate with them. So these organizations, which are now known as Indigenous Charitable Not-for-Profit, so part of civil society as a whole in Canada, have been coming together for many years and discussing different issues facing us or confronting us in cities. And because these populations are now the fastest growing in Canada, almost 80% now of all Indigenous persons live off of reserves. And groups like Métis have been off reserve all of their lives. So the urban situation is a very unique one, and that's proven in academic literature. So Environics, which is a research firm, polling firm, did a survey of urban Indigenous persons to determine how we were different. And so when the survey was complete, it was one interesting outcome was that 86% of all of the urban Indigenous that were surveyed loved Canada, loved their country, in spite of the history. So that was fascinating even to me, who had lived off the reserve all my life, because, you know, one would think that from the treatment we talk about, from what we've experienced, racism, discrimination, all of those things, ugly things, that we still love our country. And most of us who work in cities are focused on how, you know, how we can improve spiritual, cultural, social, and economic conditions overall. Another big part of our work is how can we engage with other Canadians to improve relationship, to truly get to know each other, to understand history in a better way, and particularly from the Indigenous perspective of all of that. And this is really important because, you know, many Canadians maybe don't appreciate that the creation of the reserve system in Canada segregated us from other Canadians. So how can people get to know each other if you're over there and I'm over there? You know, it's a simple equation. I mean, I live in Winnipeg and I have a neighbor on my right and a neighbor on my left, and we're separated by a fence. If I don't try to talk to him or her, or vice versa, we're never going to get to know each other. And that's so vivid and so real to me because where I lived for 20 years, I had a Portuguese family living on one side and a single Caucasian male on the other. And before I left, I had eaten dinner in both places. I went over for coffee, or, you know what I mean? We truly became friends. And then we got to know each other. And in the Portuguese family, I learned that one of the daughters-in-law was a First Nations person. And so they had granddaughters who were of First Nations ancestry. So segregation, you know, is spoken to for a long time now, and particularly the effects and the consequences of desegregation. And that goes back to an old case in the United States called Brown versus the Board of Education. And the impacts of segregation are powerful, and they can be lifelong impacts. And so it explains why some of our people are so reluctant to reach out to other Canadians, to engage with other Canadians, to truly to get to know other Canadians. So, and the urban experience is becoming more fascinating by the minute. So you may know there was a famous case in Canada where those of us who lived off reserve got the right to vote in on-reserve elections. And so now some bands in Canada, quite a few bands, there are more of their members living off reserve than on. So theoretically, if those individuals were to organize at a higher level, not theoretically, but practically, they could take over the reserve from off the reserve. So these are some of the challenges. And so I think there's a signal now that some bands are starting to recognize the importance of their off-reserve members. And so recently I was able to view two resolutions at the Assembly of First Nations from two chiefs in Manitoba, moved and seconded, that are requesting the federal government to allow them to do a demonstration project to give them money to be able to serve their members more effectively who are off reserve. So, some of our speakers before had been, or our elder who spoke to us, our teacher, was talking about, this broader definition of rights. And I sit here today being the only elected person representing an urban Indigenous community in Canada, Winnipeg. And the organization was established in 1994 and is a sort of a forerunner of what might be a brighter future. And so in our coalition in Winnipeg or in Manitoba, that's the big difference, is that the Aboriginal Council that I lead, being an urban political voice and having a long history and having done a lot of research, undertook a lot of projects to demonstrate our local capacity, really, really critical going forward in a time of truth and reconciliation, because reconciliation just doesn't apply to our relationship with other Canadians. It also applies to our relationship with each other. And in this case, a budding relationship between First Nations to themselves, Métis, and Inuit. And again, with a looking forward, moving from having no formal agreements between us to working with each other and establishing formal agreements. And then gaining strength in that process to be able to better challenge the issues we're facing in cities like Winnipeg and Saskatoon, in fact, all over Canada. And particularly huge issues like homelessness, which I'm sure some of you have seen here in Saskatoon. And and what homelessness, the issues that homelessness creates for individuals, and how quickly, in our case, we have many individuals dying literally almost every day because of primarily having to deal with addictions and mental health issues and not having access to the level of resources that they need. So I think the coming together of urban communities with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit political structure will be a boon for all of us over time. Because again, if we live by our historic values of sharing and caring for each other, then that's the natural place for us to go. So the urban community has much to offer to the other three groups as they have to us. And it's in those sharings of how to better do things that we will slowly and steadily bring positive change to the social determinants of health outcomes, which to me is the most important work I do. I don't really pay much attention to the fact of the label I wear, President of the Aboriginal Council of Winnipeg. I'm sitting on 7 boards in my community. I work every day to help organizations that get into difficulties. And that's the practical side of my work that to me, brings me the most, I guess, awareness and sense of actually, getting something done for a community. And I know Lindsay and all of you that do this same type of work probably have that same appreciation. So it's in a time of UNDRIP, again, as an urban political leader, if you go back to 1876, when the current Indian Act was put in place, it immediately became clear we're not Canadians. We weren't Canadians. We had no rights. Our treaties were put in a kind of suspended animation. We couldn't hire lawyers to protect those rights. And then when you put on top of that the creation of the residential schools, the 60 Scoop, the Indian Day schools, the damage is incredible. And it's 300 or more years in the making. So today, when you leave here, and you may see an Indigenous person struggling on the streets, maybe intoxicated, maybe suffering from a use of some drug, I hope you'll have a better appreciation of why. And we can't change these things by ourselves. We absolutely need the support and cooperation of other Canadians. And to me, that's the door that UNDRIP and Truth and Reconciliation, the calls to action, that's the door that these things open wider. And it's the responsibilities of leaders to use these tools to improve things for members of their community. And as one of the older leaders now in Canada, I was in the room with the first Prime Minister Trudeau when we entrenched ourselves in the Constitution. I was in the room when Jim Sinclair from Saskatchewan stood up and demanded a seat for the Métis. And now this week I was interviewed by one of the local news outlets, and they asked me what I thought of the new Manitoba Métis Federation, the Métis Nation of Manitoba Treaty, Red River Métis. And of course, first word out of my mouth was I was so proud for them, because in Ontario, I had been a Secretary Treasurer of the Ontario Métis and Non-Status Indian Association. And I worked with the Métis all my life. And to see them achieve, self-government is incredible. And all of us in the room who are Indigenous should be so proud of that, because it's happened in such a short period of time. Our movement only started in the 60s. So we've got to stop beating ourselves up. We've made incredible progress in a very short period of time. Yes, we have a lot of work to do, but pat yourself on the back. And our greatest challenge right now is not about, we don't know what the solutions are. We do know what the solutions are. We just don't have the capacity, the money, or the resources to be able to serve the needs of all of our people, wherever they live. And right now, that's the saddest part of it, is that, in Manitoba, we had 4 First Nations communities declare a state of emergency this year because of the conditions on reserve and the you know, the huge challenges they're facing to heal themselves. And again, when we talk about healing, that's holistic. That's all parts of our being. And of course, our world is a circle and it's inclusive of everything. So when we talk about healing, it's spiritual, it's emotional, right? It's physical, and it's mental. So again, going forward, the practical side of everything is answering that question. If Canada, in its discrimination against us, kept us from sharing our ways of knowing, being, seeing, and doing with other Canadians, can we do that now? And in that learning from each other, can we create a better Canada? Are most of us willing to do that or to go there? That's the practical side of it. And someone here mentioned, I don't know if they mentioned it, but they use the term supremacy. And sometimes it's, and I try not to use color to describe another human being, because that's been used on me all my life. So, but there are terms in the language, white supremacy. And I would argue that the Indian Act was supremacy, is supremacy. And I find it hard to sit here and appreciate that we have UNDRIP, we have the Canadian government recognizing UNDRIP and legislation doing that. And we still have the Indian Act of 1876, which is about control of Indians and lands reserved for Indians. And the two are as opposite as you can get. So I think part of our struggle in Canada to improve relationships, to make truth and reconciliation real, to make UNDRIP real, is to have more Canadians understand what I've shared with you today. And it's my belief that the majority of Canadians are not racist. There may be a high level of ignorance, and ignorance just means you don't know. And how can you know if you're not engaging with each other? So I'm trying to make what I'm sharing with you today practical. That in my 75 years of life, I've worked so hard to build good relationships in my community with anyone. And as long as there's walls between us, there's danger to all of us, because that's what happens, conflict. And conflict is not good for anyone, serious conflict. And what, you know, I sit here today watching what's happening in the United States, who's been our good neighbor for forever and a day, mostly, tearing itself apart with division, with hatred. And I'm hoping that we're not going to go there in Canada. But there's some signals here that that's possible too. So thank you and for allowing me to share. And you know.
Thank you, Damon. I do have one more question for Saigesh, and what I would like to do is to be able to invite my colleagues and panel members to be able to share additional final thoughts based on what they've heard from the conversation so far. We've heard a lot of really amazing education, I think, from panel members, and what we've heard that there really is an incongruency between the infrastructure that is currently being created, the philosophy of the EDI infrastructure that is being created is really incongruent with what we're hoping to see in terms of transformative change as it pertains to Indigenous people. That reconciliation is often very performative, and it doesn't hold accountable organizations and infrastructures that ought to be perhaps held accountable. And there's no real transformative change that is coming out of the of what we have currently seen. So my question is how are aspirations for reconciliation different than UNDRIP as a legal instrument? And if panel members would like to respond as well, this question, Saigesh, if you wouldn't mind responding to that. So the
Well,
question is, yeah, so the question is how is reconciliation, how is UNDRIP different from reconciliation, and how can we hope that UNDRIP might be a tool, a legal tool for that transformative change that we're hoping to be able to see?
Well, it's in the TRCs, they keep saying that UNDRIP is the best method for reconciliation. But the reconciliation they're talking about is very broad versus what other people think about reconciliation. So UNDRIP is one of the vectors that allow humans to be humans and Indigenous people to be Indigenous people. And both of them have to meet on understanding that they're human and that all these artificial structures like federal governments, provincial municipalities are supposed to be meeting their ends. But if they're not in their policies and programs really benefiting the human rights of each of the persons, then there's not going to be reconciliation. That so many people just think reconciliation is a way to coexist equally on a sort of a personal basis, and that's all they have to do. But there's so much more that has to be done in reconciliation, including free, active, and meaningful participation in policies and programs and budgets and plannings as a fundamental right. And those need to be fleshed out. They're given to us by the constitutional rights, but they're also given to us by UNDRIP. But only humans and their organizations can push the other agencies, the artificial municipalities. And
I think my comments would be that I'm not sure how UNDRIP will be honored, implemented without Canadians engaging in a process of decolonization and Canadians understanding the impact of the racism against Indigenous people that has been embedded in our public education system, our higher education system. So the fact of, the profound dehumanization of Indigenous people such that there are too many people living homelessly without basic human needs being met in a country that more than has the capacity in terms of resources. And so the fact that we are living in this day and age with such a disparity in wealth, and we cannot find the resources for housing and food, just basic human needs. And so we're here discussing EDI, JEDI, and we as Indigenous people are asked to provide solutions and to tell the colonizers, what needs to change and how that needs to change. And yet we're at the same time, we're saying as Indigenous people, give us our rights, honor our rights. And so it's like we're asking permission. We're asking permission First Nations government organizations are asking for the right to make decisions on behalf of our lives and our communities and our people. So what does it take then for governments, organizations, municipalities to get out of the way, and leave the resources there that are there? Because clearly we live in what some people say is one of the best countries in the world. So how could it be that we have the needs of Indigenous people, which is like a common phenomena in former British colonies, wherever you go? So we make it into a mystery, as if it's a mystery. And the mystery is really that Indigenous people are not seen as human beings worthy of dignity and respect. And unless that changes, I'm not sure if we're going to have the people that can implement and carry through UNDRIP sitting across the table, seeing us as people.
Yes, I have thoughts about UNDRIP versus reconciliation and EDI. And I just wanted to remind us that when we think about these different instruments, we have to remember that they were never kind of like just granted to us by the powers, because they had a realization that these rights were necessary. All these instruments took a lot of organization, globally, activism, advocacy throughout the years, and needless to say, the resistance and resilience of people doing this work. So I learned many years ago that the limits of multiculturalism and EDI is that it celebrates diversity without acknowledging power. I learned that here from Dr. Verna St. Denis scholarship. And so obviously, yeah, as I was saying before, it's not a problem to celebrate the diversity of Indigenous people, right? That doesn't bother anybody. Also, I think that in the context of reconciliation, it doesn't bother anybody to hear the trauma stories and the suffering stories of Indigenous peoples. I find that all very functional to the status quo. And when you were talking about the outcomes of Indigenous people right now, that's precisely what the policies were designed to do, right? They're not an accident. A couple of days ago, we were talking about missing and murdered Indigenous women and Garrison to Spirit, and how there's this notion sometimes in some institutions that we can only grieve. The only thing we can do about missing and murdered Indigenous women is grieve, because it's sort of like inevitable. It's just what happens to Indigenous women, right? Their life choices, as opposed to understanding how the lives of Indigenous women who are living in poverty, isolation, without any kind of supports and policies that guarantee a minimum livable life, right, are targeting, Indigenous women for a reason. And it's absolutely preventable if we had the policies that upheld our human rights and etc. Again, I find that all these tactics can be employed and should be employed along with other tactics. So legal tactics like using UNDRIP every time that it's relevant, cultural tactics, invoking the reconciliation language whenever it's possible, but to call out the present, right? Not to continue to, because for a lot of people, again, witnessing Indigenous trauma, it doesn't challenge their understanding of how they're implied in that harm that it's being perpetrated, right? They can see themselves as innocent and disconnected from that reality very easily, right? And again, just see it as something inevitable the poverty of Indigenous people, inevitable, right? So again, I think that along with those tactics, we should be deploying electoral tactics, right? Organization, economics, grassroots, all tactics have a value and a purpose and a potential and limitations. So that would be my answer.
I think what you're describing is apathy among Canadians toward Indigenous people. And so reconciliation is an easy buzzword. It makes folks feel good. I used to have a boss that used to often say to me, I need you to be uncomfortable. And I couldn't understand it at the time because I was in my 20s and I was still a little bit spicy and resistant to these kinds of things. But later when I reflected on what he said, it rang true that during my most uncomfortable moments did I do my best growing, learning, and understanding. And I don't think that it's enough to move the needle on whatever the word of the day is, whether it's inclusion for Indigenous folks, whether it's reconciliation with truth that comes before that. It's fundamentally about transforming systems, and systems are developed by humans. And to reiterate some of what my friends have already said, I think in my mind, it's about transforming humans at a heart level, to move away from apathy to empathy and relatability. I think Damon speaks a lot about this as human beings, Indigenous, non-Indigenous. I think we have a responsibility to each other to find those ways to relate, to communicate, to build relationships, to build awareness and understanding, in an effort to transform the systems, because those very same systems won't change until hearts and minds change, because humans built them, humans maintain them. And so those are the folks that we have to, I think, try to convince or try to build relationships with. I also think to some of the earlier comments made, to recap, that a re-education of an entire nation has to occur. Generations of people who came here were miseducated about us. And they continue to be, because we know that the education system is dictated at a provincial territorial level. So if you come to Ontario, our curriculum, well, our friend Ford changed that for us. So we don't have a strong curriculum that is helping to educate our students. I'm sure many of you spend time in spaces where Indigenous folks are educating non-Indigenous folks. And I think reconciliation in my mind is somewhat achieved when my little boy, who's now 8, never ever has to stand in front of a room full of non-Indigenous people explaining who we are, where we come from, because the government will have done its job and co-development with us and collaboration with us to help re-educate our nation. Now we'll go.
Yeah, think of what I was going to say there. Exactly. Yeah. So, yeah, I guess, where are we going? I said, I get a little emotional about this stuff, but I think the bottom line is each of us has to be able to look in the mirror and, really question where you are in terms of others. And if the answer to your question isn't a good one, then, what are we going to change? And that applies to each of us. I worked for the city of Winnipeg for 15 years, and we had different leaders in that over that period of time, and the senior management level. And we had a chief commissioner system, and our chief commissioner was a person by the name of Rick Frost, who introduced me and other employees to the notion of continuous improvement, quality improvement. And this is how things change. So he taught that to us as a system. A man named Deming created this system to help Japan recover its economy after the Second World War. So I took continuous improvement one step forward, and I said, I'm going to apply this to myself. Can I be a better person tomorrow than I am today? And what can I do to guide myself in that? and this would may be different for each of us, but I have the 7 teachings of the Anishinaabe people on my wall, right? And they're very simple. There's 7 of them. And when I look at those, that's all the rules I need in my life. And I have them on my board, and I walk in there every day, every morning, and I look at them and I could see right away where I've fallen down, where I haven't lived up to those rules. And that's what it comes down to us. We have to appreciate that the responsibility for a better world, for a better Canada, for a better, in my case, Manitoba, Winnipeg, that comes back to me and what I do each day to try and make it better. And if I keep that in the back of my mind, if that's my motivation, if that's driving how I work and why I work and where I work and who I work with, it's that simple, really. And far too many of us think that, it's somebody else's responsibility. It isn't, it's all of ours. So thank you. And I hope that you take that, we could take that lesson home with us, and it makes us, maybe helps us become better people, because we can do that. Okay, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Damon, for their final thoughts. I want to express gratitude so much, Saigesh, for joining us, for taking the time to be able to share your knowledge and your experience, and greatly contributed to our conversation that we had today and that we hosted. So thank you so much for joining us. Also to the panelists, grateful, not only to be colleagues, but to be friends working towards better outcomes. And I'm grateful for you agreeing to be a part of the panel, and for sharing your incredible knowledge with us. So thank you to everyone. Thank you to the folks who joined us on Zoom, and thank you to folks who actually came in person as well. If you were able to make it, we're grateful to have you. I would like to invite folks also to be able to visit us, the National Urban Indigenous Coalitions Council online. And you will also find where our Knowledge Hub will be hosting ongoing conversations as well monthly. The Knowledge Hub hosts monthly conversations. So please visit us there, and you can watch us and see what we're doing next online. So thank you once again for everybody for joining, and have safe journeys home. And I hope that we've provided some thought-provoking material and information for you this afternoon. Thanks so much.